We looked at decarbonizing India and some strategies for long-term developments in a low-emission pathway. India committed to net zero by 2070, and this report here from the Climate Group, which is an international non-profit with lots of partners, wrote this report on India net zero steel demand outlook. We've talked about steel and cement as big emitters which need to reduce their contributions. Steel contributes to about 8% of the global emissions annually. Just to start with a brief introduction, which we have talked about already, 70% of the steel made in 2020 comes from the so-called primary route, which is here route 1, where iron ore is mined and then put through this process, which includes some very high emission processes. So coke is heated to produce coke, which is then fed into a blast furnace to reduce the iron ore, which is the oxidized form of iron, and then that's fed into a so-called I think it's a basic oxygen furnace where the oxygen levels are adjusted to create steel. So there are various steps that I'm not going to go into. The secondary steel, which is about 25% of the steel made in 2020, this is global, comes from scrap, so recycled steel, which is obviously much less emitting compared to the primary steel, which is starting from iron ore, which is a very heavy energy intensive process. So here the various methods considered include things like direct reduction iron instead of this blast furnace process, using electric arc furnace instead of these coke furnaces. There are electrolysis methods considered, which are supposed to produce green steel, but scaling and functional prototypes at scale are not ready yet. So we are basically still relying on technological promises, but again, hopefully we will get this done globally. Coming back to India, India requires a strong demand for clean, low carbon steel to decouple industrial emissions from economic growth. So there is the supply side where the big companies are producing steel, and then there is the demand side, which we'll look at, obviously infrastructure, buildings, and various other production processes. So can the demand side push for clean, low carbon steel? So that's something that has to worry about, that we have to think about. There is a lot of numbers here that I won't go into, but we will look at the numbers here that are key. For example, 430 million tons by 2050 from 103 million tons in 2021 instead of in terms of the expected demand growth. So steel making is one of the biggest emitters of carbon, and Indian steel sector contributes nearly 12% of overall greenhouse gas emissions for the country. So obviously it's higher than the global average of 8%. So it's a dirty industry in that sense. The India Net Zero Steel Demand Outlook report, main findings are that it examines the nature and characteristics of steel demand in India, provides a view of the low carbon steel opportunity at a sectoral level with focus on key sectors such as automotive, construction, infrastructure, and capital goods sectors. Underpins the importance of demand-side policy action for a greater demand pool for low-carbon steel, and identified policy insights learning from the other geographies, so other countries are looked at for contrast. Highlights the critical role of global standards and certifications that steel producers can adopt to meet an early trajectory. Evaluates the business environment to incentivize production of low carbon steel along with use of scrap steel. So there are some ideas provided for how to collect scrap and then feed it to new steel manufacturing, and reducing, of course, the direct or primary steel production from iron ores. Further, Steel Zero, the Climate Group's initiative, brings together ambitious and forward-looking steel buying organizations to harness their collective purchasing power and send a demand signal in shifting global markets and policies for responsible production and sourcing of steel. This seems to work for many industries when customers, buyers, consumers demand greener products. Industries pay attention. Whether there is greenwashing and whether there is transparency in reporting, monitoring, verification of these so-called green methods and green products is a big task, just like organic food, for example, where people buy things that are labeled organic, but then there are lots of issues about who's making sure that they in fact are organic. Works for recycling as well. Many things that are supposed to be recyclable are actually not recyclable in reality, and so on. So this is a constant battle. Businesses that join Steel Zero make a public commitment to use, procure, and specify 100% net zero steel by 2050. So this is an initiative from Climate Group. In this regard, the India Net Zero Steel Demand Outlook explains the criteria for buyer-side companies who make this commitment and interprets broadly the standards of responsible steel for steel producers. The report will serve as a vital tool for companies that are pursuing a net zero strategy to reduce their scope 3 emissions, we will see that in a minute, and for investors and philanthropic donors in identifying gaps in mobilizing concerted and well-rounded action on decarbonization of steel. Main findings from the report are here. Key findings from the report 1, 2, 3, 4. So here 430 million tons of annual demand by 2050, 1 billion tons of carbon emissions annually from the sector by 2050. So there is the idea of blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route that has to change and go towards low emissions. And expected rise of blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace route share will add to industry's average emissions intensity by 0.14 ton CO2 per ton of steel produced by 2030. In the second, more than 85% of the total steel demand is in India from construction, infrastructure, and automobiles and capital goods. 204 million tons of CO2 from upstream scope 3 emissions. So scope 1 and 2 are what are being emitted to manufacture steel, and scope 3 is after the steel has been manufactured and shipped to end users like construction, infrastructure, automobiles, and so on. So who worries about scope 3? The manufacturers themselves are now required to worry about scope 3 as well, which we'll look at in a minute. Large organized players constitute only around 10% of the construction sector. 70% of India's 2030 urban infrastructure is yet to be built. So like China, India is going to keep on building enormous amounts of infrastructure projects, undergo many implementation of many projects for roads, bridges, even charging stations, and so on. 38 million tons by 2050 in terms of automobiles, and 27 million tons of CO2 from their upstream scope 3 emissions. Demand of steel from capital goods manufactured domestically is projected at 35 million tons by 2030. So green steel should be a key priority in this sense, and as scope 3 emissions form 90% of their net emissions. Thirdly, early investments in R&D and pilot projects on carbon capture, utilization, and storage and green hydrogen-driven direct reduction iron are required to meet the goal of eliminating majority of the remaining 30% of the emissions by 2050. These are kind of the key levers that are identified. Scrap-based steel production emits only around 0.5 ton CO2 as compared to 2.5 ton CO2 through production from iron ore, so primary versus secondary there. Ship recycling is well positioned to address India's growing scrap deficit by potentially contributing up to 10 million tons of high-grade scrap steel by 2030. In terms of policy levers, Learning and contextualizing from initiatives such as CBAM, emissions trading scheme, R&D funding, etc., implemented across EU, China, South Korea, US, and Japan will be key to India as well. So India can learn from those. Existing policies such as the Vehicle Scrapping Policy 2021, FAME India scheme, Smart Cities, and GRIHA have the potential to incrementally nudge industry towards adoption and use of low carbon steel. We'll look at some of these acronyms later, but you can look them up. I'm not going to go into the details. Increasing use of renewable energy, H2 or biomass injection, and improving material and process efficiency will further strengthen the policy measures. Okay, so let's look at some numbers after looking at these important findings. Here are the final figures based on average of the 4 approaches outlined adjacently. So the report takes multiple approaches to look at demand and capacity from 2021 out to 2050. Expected demand and capacity of crude steel in India in millions of tons. So grays are the demand and capacity is in blue. So demand has been at 103 million tons in 2021 and supply or capacity at 143. That's not necessarily a supply. 2022 120 to 154, both have gone up. 2030 they are expected to further go up. Demand to 193 and capacity to 227. By 2040 and 2050 we are up here at 433 million tons versus capacity of 509 million tons. In the business as usual scenario where nothing is done, essentially we continue with the current practices. These do not decouple emissions from production, and this may lead to over 1 billion tons of CO2 emissions annually from the Indian steel sector by 2050. In 2019, India emitted around 2.5 gigaton CO2. It's not equivalent, so CO2 itself, 7% of the global emissions, with steel sectors contributing around 304 million tons, so that's 12% of total India emissions, higher than the global average of 8%. This is okay. India's CO2 emissions, power generation dominates, but here you have iron and steel industry at 12%, and of course agriculture is a major player, buildings and transportation add the rest. Emissions by scope, so scope 1 is at 68%, so includes the supply of feedstocks, etc. Scope 3 is at 28%, which is pretty high. Scope 2 in the manufacturing process, so scope 1 and 2 are to the step of producing steel, and this is after it's been produced. Emissions from steel demand, so demand and emissions in a business as usual scenario. So you can see that business as usual is obviously much higher than in the emissions scenarios to meet the commitments to NDC and global warming scenarios, etc. So 103 in 2021 from steel demand, 120 rising to 433 by 2050. So if no additional measures are undertaken, so business as usual scenario, the strong growth of carbon intensive steel industry will lead to almost doubling of emissions by 2030, so 250 to 480, and quadrupling, so 1080 by 2050. So obviously India needs to do something. The route-wise capacity of India in 2021 and 2022 here, direct reduction iron versus blast furnace and basic oxygen furnace, so this still dominates at 43%, with electric arc furnace is at 6%, and scrap electric arc furnace is at 25% in terms of capacity. Largest consumer of steel in India in 2022, intermediate products, consumer durables, automobiles at 9%, capital goods at 10%, infrastructure dominates at 23%, and construction is at 45%. So lots of new buildings coming up, developing economy, and infrastructure corresponding to that in terms of trains, roads, bridges, dams, and so on and so forth. Okay, 72 to 74% of the greenhouse gas emissions in the blast furnace basic oxygen furnace route is scope 1 and 2, which is mainly contributed by the use of fossil fuel at different stages of the value chain. I won't go into the details, but obviously route 1 and scope 1 and 2 include mining, upstream logistics and other, material processing, iron making, steel making, finishing, and then downstream logistics and other. So everything else that comes after in terms of the use is what is scope 3, right? Construction and infrastructure, automobiles and capital goods constitute more than 85% of the total steel demand in India. So here you have construction, infrastructure, automobiles, capital goods, consumer goods, and other. The share in 2030 is expected to be 60% for these and 22% for consumer goods. And I won't go into these details here. Private versus low private share is shown here, so government, and you can look at increasing steel consumption intensity and decreasing steel consumption intensity in these sectors. So steel intensity is going to go up in construction and infrastructure. Automobiles will go down because of the various materials that are being used, composite materials, etc., and not much change expected in other sectors here. Clear pathways exist for effective and efficient deployment of levers that can impact the entire value chain of steel production. Okay, so the levers include energy and fuel mix optimization, process and material efficiency, circular resource utilization, and carbon capture and storage or offsets. Obviously these are technological promises here. There are sub-levers and there are areas of impact and value chain applicability, which I'm not going to read, but the report is online, so you can go and read the details. Okay. As available levers can achieve 50% to 70% decarbonization, net zero initiatives will be key to create an ambitious demand pull, fostering much needed innovation to meet 100% decarbonization by 2050. Okay, so just look at the key words here: circular use, process and material efficiency, energy, fuel and mix optimization, energy and fuel mix optimization. Total of above mentioned pathways is only 50 to 70% here. Carbon capture and utilization, hydrogen and offsets are remaining 50 to 30%. Implementation drivers in each of these include technology, ecosystems, and cost. So you can see the favorability in terms of green being high, red being low or not available, and the orange being moderate. So you have to map those things correspondingly. Emissions reduction timelines in tons of CO2 for tons of steel produced. You can see FY 25 to 30, so low extent of adoption of each of these, and have to hit high by the time you get to financial year 46 to 50. Use of waste heat recovery has to basically max out in terms of full adoption by the 30s, and similarly for process and material efficiency have to reach their full adoption here. Energy and fuel mix will go on for some time, but by 2050 everybody has to reach high adoption for accomplishing this remaining 50 to 30% to reach 100% decarbonization. While India's steel landscape is unique, it can borrow and contextualize learnings from policy trajectories adopted by other key steel producing regions and countries. Again, I won't read the details, but various ideas from the EU, China, South Korea, US, and Japan are mentioned here. So for EU, Circular Economy Action Plan, EU Emissions Trading, Clean Steel Partnership, CBAM, so reducing carbon leakage in import, and France. So these are roadmap for mandating 31 reduction in CO2 emissions, 31% reduction in CO2 emissions by 2030 by France, for example. China has reduction in fossil fuel mix, national trading system for carbon emissions, and then a couple of other ideas. South Korea is heavily into emissions trading scheme. US can give ideas on waste heat recovery and focus on energy efficiency. Japan has lessons for India in terms of R&D funding and energy. Okay. The steel sector needs to respond fast and effectively to meet India's nationally determined contributions as well as the net zero goal by 2070. So there are various ideas for NDC, updated NDC commitments. India has submitted its plan. It has joined the International Solar Alliance, and there is the Bharat stage emissions norms that are in place. So according to the Energy Transition Commission, embedded emissions from material usage is expected to represent more than half of an EV's lifestyle emissions by 2030, compared with around 20% of lifestyle emissions for an internal combustion vehicle today. So all these kinds of details have to be worried about. National Action Plan on Climate Change is in place. Amongst these, solar mission, NMEEE and NMSKCC have significant impact on providing directional guidance for decarbonization initiatives in the steel industry. You can look up the acronyms here. For example, enhanced energy efficiency with the solar emissions gives us NMEEE, and strategic knowledge for climate change is the national mission on SKCC. Okay, so additional policies and initiatives can ensure the right pace for development and penetration of low carbon steel across industry segments and value chains. Here, green steel inclusion within voluntary targets, policy mandates for green steel procurement, pooled purchase commitment, premium for low emission production in terms of incentivizing, mandatory inclusion of scope 3 emissions in reporting, collaborative R&D, phasing out of aged carbon intensive assets, national roadmap for decarbonization in steel. Okay, so that's kind of a quick run through to see how the steel demand side pull on reducing emissions of steel production can be accomplished to help the net zero goals and the global warming target requirements by 2050. Okay, so please go ahead and consult the report if you want more details. As usual, I'm very brief and pick points that I consider important from a very subjective point of view. Okay.